Hello, everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes here. Just let any other folks join. As people are joining, just so you know, we're going to wait a few minutes before kicking this off. And we'll wait just another minute or so for any attendees to join. I see the numbers are sort of leveling out, so. Okay. I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar on CI/CD pipelines for Kubernetes apps featuring Pulumi and Codefresh. We will have about, we'll leave some time at the end for any questions, but there, if you noticed on your webinar tab there is a Q&A tab you can use if you want to post questions while we're going through. We have a few folks on the call who will be able to answer you, or we'll just hold those to the end. And afterwards, you can always join the community Slack for Pulumi for any additional help. So we're going to start with a poll. So let me start, whoops. Let me start the poll here, get some insight into how folks are using some of these tools today. And so if you could reply to the polls that should be popping up on your screen. And again, I'll give a few minutes for everyone to reply. if you did just join, we are kicking off with a little bit of a poll to get a sense of where people are in terms of Kubernetes and Pulumi and Codefresh. Alrighty, looks like the polling has tailed off. Oh, I see a couple more. Again, feel free to add. I'll leave the polls open as we go through this. But it looks like a pretty good mix. I mean, I see, you know, of the sample space that we have, right, in terms of Kubernetes usage, there's a good amount in production. I'm glad to see there's a lot of folks who have not used Pulumi or Codefresh yet. That's always good to provide a nice introduction, but I do see some users, which is great. And appreciate it. Like I said, I'll leave those polls open if you want to, for those of you who haven't responded. All right. For those of you in North America, if you stay till the end, and I'm sure you will, because it's going to be a very fun webinar, we will reach out to you and send you a Pulumi t-shirt. And our speakers today, I'm Mitch Gerdisch. I'll be doing most of the blathering, at least for the first part. I'm a senior sales engineer at Pulumi. I've been involved with infrastructure as code, arguably since the early days of AWS when I was hacking out shell scripts and against their CLI. But in earnest, I've been involved in infrastructure as code in one way or another for the past 7 or 8 years. Praneet, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Hey, everyone. I'm Praneet. I'm a software engineer at Pulumi, and I really enjoy working on CI/CD integrations, and you'll probably see my name quite a bit over at Pulumi with regards to that. Most recently, I worked on releasing the feature called Integration Assistant that makes it easy for you to get started with CI/CD workflows right from your Pulumi console. But today I will be answering any questions that you have about Pulumi and using Pulumi and CI/CD and specifically also Codefresh. So feel free to ask any questions and I'll be happy to answer them.
Very good. Kostis?
Hello, everybody. My name is Kostis. I'm a software engineer slash developer advocate for Codefresh. In my previous life, I was a Java developer for 15 years, and then I discovered my love for CI/CD. And also today with me, I have Anais, who in her previous life was a developer for crypto, but then she also discovered her love for CI/CD, and she's also with Codefresh.
Very good. Thank you. So the agenda for today, so we have the polls going. Again, I'll just leave them open. We're going to start with just some sort of overview of infrastructure as code, CI/CD. We'll discuss Pulumi to some levels, you know, in specifics, if you will, and Codefresh, and how the two work together. And then we'll jump over to a live demo. So this is the a variation on the ubiquitous cloud journey slide that I'm sure everyone on this call has seen in one way or another. You know, usually it's presented as, okay, company X, here you are on the journey to cloud. And really, I think that's a bit of a misstatement, right? I think really the fact of the matter is companies, within a given company, you're going to have different projects that are using different architectures. And whether you call it, you know, some place on the spectrum of this quote unquote cloud journey is going to be applicable to you, right? So you're going to have N-tier apps, you know, whether they're legacy, whether they're new, and they just need to be sort of a classic N-tier app. You might have some hybrid models where you're using, the sort of classic N tier plus some containers, and then, the what's generally referred to as the modern cloud architectures where you're using Kubernetes and serverless and functions and, et cetera. And really, again, and then you have the different, engineers, the different project team members who have different experiences, different backgrounds, different, knowledge bases, if you will. And so you really need tools that can support the entire spectrum at any time, not only to enable the various forms of deployments, but also not, to make sure that they don't preclude you from evolving to what's, currently the modern architecture or what might be coming tomorrow. As I like to think of it, it's this cloud journey analogy is not really a train ride from Miami to, New York or something. It's really an amusement park. Sometimes you're on the teacups, sometimes you're on the roller coaster, sometimes you're on the Ferris wheel, and you need to be able to handle all of those use cases. And that whole transformation, that cloud journey is changing how people are working, right? It's the sort of self-service nature of cloud, the ability to get infrastructure very easily, is changing the whole premise of how things are operating within companies. The classic central IT team, which required a set of skills around, in the olden days, stacking hardware and networking and cabling, even in the virtualization world, being able to create VMs and, setting up the virtual networks and the firewalls and all that. That skill set is still very important, but then that central team now needs to also evolve to become really a center of excellence, establishing best practices, establishing, reusable code, if you will, or reusable assets, and identifying tool sets that will enable this DevOps model. And those, and they're working in the context of the app teams, which are traditionally, are going to be more the application development teams who don't necessarily want to know how to create, say, a Kubernetes cluster, but want to be able to use it. And, within the requirements of security, and then sort of this broader concept that Pulumi generally promotes is this idea of cloud engineering, where again, you have teams that are doing all of it together. The code is, it almost starts to blur the lines between the code, if you will, of applications and infrastructure. And, this can be achieved in, various ways, again, but some of them aren't scalable, right? So I could achieve those goals by clicking on buttons on a web UI for a cloud environment, for example. But obviously that's not scalable. It's not scalable in terms of human power. It's not scalable in terms of time. So then maybe I can write, use some CLI scripts, some shell scripts around, wrapped around CLI, or use a JSON or a YAML format to deploy and define that infrastructure. And that works to a point. It definitely helps with the speeding up of the activities, but it doesn't always scale very well when you start to get to more complex projects. And so really, the idea is you want to do it in code. You want to do it in a programming language. You want to be able to define that infrastructure in a way that is very amenable to maintainability, reusability, et cetera. And that's really where Pulumi comes in, right? Pulumi, as we like to say, is modern infrastructure as code. I actually like to say software, in the sense that you're leveraging programming languages that you're familiar with. You're leveraging all the tools and the ecosystem around those programming languages, and you're able to apply those to whatever sort of endpoint you want. Cloud endpoints, as well as other providers, other services like, say, Datadog, for example. And how does that sort of manifest itself? Well, it really is infrastructure as software. Here we have a simple example, but in these few lines of code, I'm able to deploy a VPC, as opposed to clicking through a bunch of screens, as opposed to having, some sort of CloudFormation template or JSON or YAML that defines this. I'm able to declare it in my code, and around that, I'm then able to, even write, any sort of logic I might need to support that declaration. So again, I'm in a programming language, so I can use for loops, if thens, if I need to. And then this fact that I'm using a programming language then lends itself, to the bigger picture of pushing the code up into GitHub, et cetera. And when we talk about Pulumi, we're really talking about sort of two parts. There's the CLI and the SDKs, and that's the open source part of the solution, right? This is the part of the platform where that as an engineer, I'm generally using day to day. This is where I'm writing my code and whatever, the language of my, TypeScript or Python or Go or C#. And then I'm using the Pulumi CLI to essentially deploy that infrastructure as defined by that code. And again, this is where I'm sort of spending my day to day. However, we also have the Pulumi console SaaS, which provides some key features when we start talking about any sort of team level efforts. One key feature is state management. So the Pulumi SaaS provides your state management for those for that infrastructure that you're deploying, and as part of that provides any locking mechanisms and conflict management so that you're not stepping on each other's toes as a team. Additionally, the console provides features around team management, right? So team members, single sign-on, permissions, as well as policies. So Pulumi has a policy as code capability, which we call CrossGuard, but you can apply that at the organizational level. So in the Pulumi SaaS, you can define an organization and your team members, and you can also define policies that apply to that organization. So policies, a simple example might be, don't deploy more than 50 instances or something like that. But the point is you can create these policies as code and then manage those across your organization so that any team member who's deploying against that organization's infrastructure will be governed by those policies. And then other features like audit logging and history, plus a collaborative view of what's going on across the environment. Whoops. And again, so these two parts, this SDK and CLI and the console, the SaaS, really allow for agile development against my infrastructure, right? So I'm able to, again, use languages, able to use all the tools around that, and able to then have that governance and management and audit logging from the SaaS. And the end of the end point here, the bottom line here is, again, by using those languages, I'm able to use any of these providers. As you can see, these are just a subset of the various endpoints you can manage through Pulumi. And again, because I'm using languages, programming languages, I'm able to use the ecosystem that's really been developed and managed and curated over the years by the app team. So now I'm able to bring down to the infrastructure deployment that same level of agility and support tools, whether it's my IDE providing IntelliSense input to syntax and usage while I'm writing my code, as opposed to waiting till I actually have to deploy the code to see if I did it right, as well as tools and frameworks around testing, etc. So I'll pass it over to Kostis to talk a bit about Codefresh.
Yes, so next slide, please. So Codefresh is a CI/CD solution, and unlike other solutions that you may already know, it's specifically built for Kubernetes and Docker. Most other existing solutions were built in the era of virtual machines, and when containers and Kubernetes appeared, they had to adapt. With Codefresh, we did something different. We said, okay, we know containers and Kubernetes are coming, so let's build the best CI/CD solution specifically for this particular area. So the way that Codefresh works is that it's essentially a leg of containers. You create a pipeline, and each step of the pipeline that you see on the screen is a Docker container on its own. So you can do very smart things like, let's say in a project you want to use both Python 2 and Python 3. You can have a single pipeline where one step is using a Python 2 container, and another step in the same pipeline is using Python 3. And you can use this very easy without any version managers or package managers. You can use any existing image, either for a public repository like Docker Hub or a private registry like your own internal company registry. And you will see in this webinar how easy it is to use Codefresh and Pulumi, because Pulumi already provides a public Docker Hub image that contains the Pulumi executable. So we can take this Docker image and use it in Codefresh straight away. And then the next slide. The other important part is that we wanted to give our users something more. So apart from the basic capability of pipelines, we have specific graphical dashboards for Kubernetes and Docker. So for example, you can see the state of your Kubernetes cluster or the state of your Helm releases if you are using Helm. And it's very easy to follow a deployment from a Git commit until production. With other solutions, you need first to go to your CI provider and look at that dashboard to see what your pipeline is doing. Then you want to go to another dashboard to see what your Docker images are doing, and then you want to go to another dashboard to see what your cluster is doing. With Codefresh, you have all these capabilities in the same platform. It's also important to note that, like Pulumi, Codefresh is not tied to any specific cloud or Git provider, so we support all popular Git providers like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket pipelines, both in the SaaS versions and the on-premise versions. And the same thing is for Docker registries or cloud providers. So you can mix and match and use Codefresh in a similar manner, whether you use Google Cloud or Azure or AWS. And that's it for Codefresh for this part.
Excellent, thank you. And really the two together is really captured in this one slide, right? So again, the idea is as an engineer, I'm working at my workstation, writing my application code, my Pulumi, my infrastructure code, and iterating through that, directly. And then once I have it figured out, if you will, I'm able to push that into my source control. And that same code that I used, for my private testing is now able to be used by my Codefresh pipeline by leveraging Pulumi to then deploy that infrastructure. And so again, the idea is I have the source of truth that I'm confident in, that is then able to be confidently pushed out to production, staging, could even be various integration test environments. So let's go look at things here. So here we are in the Codefresh UI, and we'll start with a little bit of terminology just to kind of set the stage here. So Codefresh is the concept of projects. So here I'm looking at one project. I have multiple projects actually in this environment, like that. And I'm looking at this one project, and in this one project, I have a couple of pipelines. I have a prod pipeline and I have a staging pipeline. And a pipeline is just that, right? It's a definition of how and where to deploy whatever. In Pulumi, we have a concept of projects as well. And so in this case, I'm using the same name. So this is my project, Pulumi Codefresh. And then we have stacks. And in this case, I'm using a one-to-one mapping between the Codefresh pipeline and the Pulumi stack. However, there's really nothing stopping me from having, say, my staging pipeline, or maybe I call it my non-prod pipeline, that is used to create a different stack for every branch that gets published, right? So as I'm, if I'm using like a main trunk type of model, I'm developing on a branch, I want that to be pushed out into sort of an official testing space. I can use Pulumi, Codefresh and Pulumi to create that ephemeral, specific environment. And then once that branch gets, say, merged back into main, that will drive the prod pipeline and would also then destroy that ephemeral, if you will, branch-based pipeline and environment. So in this case, though, I'm basically using a one-to-one mapping just to make life a little bit clearer. And as you can see, I actually have my production pipeline is already up. I have 18 resources, and my staging has nothing at this point. We'll come back to this view in a minute. So if we look at the staging pipeline, what we'll see is a couple things. We'll see various builds that have occurred over time. We'll see the workflow, and we'll dig into the workflow a bit more. But really, the one thing I wanted to really click on at this point is the triggering mechanism, right? So the idea is that as events occur, say in my GitHub account, my GitHub repo, that will then trigger Codefresh to go take some action. In this case, I have this set up so that any push commit, to any branch other than main, so this is essentially a regular expression, which is saying not main, will drive this pipeline, will trigger this pipeline. As you can see, there's all sorts of other triggers available, and we're going to have a webinar later this year or quarter, I'm not sure when, where we'll get more into the bigger picture of Git ops, if you will, and these other triggers will come into play. But the point is you can use various triggers and combinations of these triggers to drive the pipeline. And as part of that pipeline, Codefresh then makes available all sorts of system, environment variables, if you will, around the Git commit, the repo, the branch, etc. That then your Codefresh workflow and Pulumi, to that extent, can take advantage of as part of the deployment. So again, normally this would get triggered by some event, like a commit to my source control. I'll just trigger it manually. And what's happening here is that workflow. I'm going to do the old baking show trick, right? I put the cake in the oven. Now I'm going to go take a baked cake out of the oven, specifically my prod environment, and we'll kind of see the end game here. And so the baked cake, if you will, is I have these various steps, and kind of note these steps, right? I have a clone repo step, prepare environment. I have this one called deploy Pulumi stack, add environment, etc. And what these workflows are doing is creating a Kubernetes cluster, then layering on top of that Kubernetes cluster namespace and config, as well as a couple of services, a basic Nginx service, as well as an Nginx-based static website service driven by a Helm chart. And that's what's happening in these pipelines. So at this point, it's created that infrastructure. It's also created a dashboard view for that Kubernetes cluster. So the idea is this can provide, my sort of single pane of glass, for lack, to overuse a term, into my cluster, into the services that are deployed there. I can use this as sort of in an ops mode. And when I destroy the stack, this will also go away, and I'll explain how that's done. And then environments. Kostis showed some of this in the slides, right? So I have these different environments. And again, the idea of an environment in Codefresh is to define, sort of your application, right? So here I have my website. If there was something going wrong with this website, I could see, okay, what happened? What broke it? What builds occurred? I can even see the commit. I can even see the specific branch change, etc. So I have all this visibility right out of Codefresh regarding this environment. So then the next question is, well, how did we get here, right? To quote the talking heads. And so let's go look at the code. So we'll start with the Codefresh workflow code, if you will, the file that defines those workflow. If you remember, if we come back here real quick, and I pop over just to kind of give you a reminder, right? I had these different steps, these different stages. Well, that's what's getting defined here, right? So clone repo, that's where I go and get the repo. And again, this is because I've been triggered by an event in GitHub. Codefresh knows, it has various, like I said, system variables that basically identify that, and I can reference those. And then I prepare the environment. And here's where I'm using that Pulumi Docker Hub image that we make available. So this is an image that we make available with each release. It has our Pulumi CLI on there. And essentially, I'm leveraging that to now execute my Pulumi code. And specifically at this stage, all I'm really doing is setting up some environment variables for later steps and installing the code I'll be showing you is TypeScript. So I'm installing my packages, my modules, and getting that all set up. And then I come and deploy the stack. And this line here is where a lot of the magic happens, right? So again, at my workstation, when I was sort of working this out, I was basically running Pulumi up from the command line on my workstation, right? I was testing the code, etc. And when I do a Pulumi up, the standard use case is, I'll get a prompt, I'll get a preview of the changes that are going to be made. And then I'm prompted, do you want to deploy, make these changes? And I say yes, and then it goes and makes the changes. Well, there's various flags I can add to that command line, especially in the context of an automation system like Codefresh, where I don't want to be, obviously, there's no human there to get prompted and respond to. So I'm basically telling it, don't prompt, go, go, go. Don't even do the preview. Just get the, just deploy the infrastructure. And if the stack, remember the stack, I didn't really explain stacks. Let me briefly. So projects in Pulumi, a project is a set of code. So basically, we're looking at the set of code, and a stack is an instantiation of that code. And so if the stack already had resources deployed to it, and this was an update, a change, then Pulumi would only make those changes, right? It understands the state of the stack and therefore will only apply changes, and will do so in the minimally invasive way, right? In other words, if it doesn't go and destroy everything and rebuild everything, it's updating the either existing resources or adding new resources. So again, basically I'm saying deploy the stuff. And this one line creates the Kubernetes cluster, the namespace, or puts the services on that Kubernetes cluster, and even creates that Kubernetes dashboard back here in Codefresh that I showed you. And the reason for that is because a couple of reasons. I wanted to show off an aspect of Pulumi where I can extend the set of providers quite easily. But really, I want that dashboard to come and go like the rest of the resources that it's reflecting. So now this Pulumi understands the state. It's going to manage the state, and later on when I do a Pulumi destroy to remove the infrastructure, it knows to delete that dashboard as well. And then we have a couple more steps in the Codefresh code, and really this is where I'm leveraging a keyword, if you will, a tag in the Codefresh YAML to create those environments, right? This is where I'm creating those little environment widgets, if you remember this view here. So essentially, and to do this, I need to tell it some things. I need to tell it the name of the cluster and the namespace that Pulumi created. And so I'm getting that as outputs from my stack, and we'll see how those are generated in a few minutes here. And that's pretty much it, right? So the real nice thing is I didn't have to put all sorts of weird, all sorts of shell scripts and what have you. Basically, I have my one command, and that's being driven by my software, which defines my infrastructure, and then using some built-in mechanisms within Codefresh to create those environment widgets. So let's look at the main program here. So that Pulumi up command, as I indicated, is creating the infrastructure. And so I'm going to briefly go through this, and then we'll come back and touch on some key aspects. So first of all, I'm creating my cluster. So here I have my declaration. And so the whole idea here is I'm declaring these resources. And then there's the provider essentially is managing the state behind the scenes. So when I do the initial up, it's going to create these resources. When I do a destroy, it knows to destroy these resources. I don't need to, it's not programmatic, right? I'm not writing code that says, if create, do this. If delete, do this. All I'm saying is create me, here's a resource I want you to create and get me to that desired state. And then if I destroy it, get me to the desired state of getting rid of the resource. So here I'm creating a cluster, and I'll show you about how that's done in a minute. And then I'm using our Kubernetes provider to layer on top of that cluster the namespace and and a couple of deployments, a couple of services. The Pulumi's Kubernetes provider is what we call a native provider. It's driven directly off of the Kubernetes open APIs, and therefore, if there's any sort of change to that API, a new capability, etc., we can actually generate and provide and update the provider within hours. I would almost say within an hour, but I might get yelled at for saying that. That's how quickly we can turn these things around. And as you see, since I'm using software, I'm actually getting IntelliSense type of inputs right here. I'm able to see what these different entries are. And as I'm typing, if I was typing this out, it would basically show me what options I have for my Kubernetes provider. Here is an export. This is how I get an output. So here I'm getting the name out of the stack to be used. If you remember, I leveraged some of these outputs in the Codefresh. But again, I'm using the Kubernetes provider to create, to layer on a namespace, and then layering on a service, a simple Nginx service, and then also an Nginx-based static website using Helm. So our Kubernetes provider also supports Helm charts. And then at the bottom here, I go and declare and create my dashboard, that Codefresh Kubernetes dashboard using this provider, which I'll explain in a minute. Now, as I mentioned, this is essentially the project code, and then an instantiation of that, a Pulumi up against this, will create a given stack. And I am able to create as many stacks as I want against this code. And those stacks can have stack-specific configuration. And so if you notice over here, if you're kind of looking, you may notice that there's these little files here for prod and staging. And these are basically where I can store stack-specific configuration. And there's a couple things I want to point out here. One is, again, I can have stack-specific configuration, like maybe my staging environment I deploy to central, maybe my prod I deploy to east. If maybe I have a configuration in here about number of pods in my cluster, and I can drive different sizes of the cluster, for staging versus prod. Whatever I want, I can capture here. Plus, I can capture sensitive data, if you will. So I have an API key for Codefresh, actually, and that's used to create that dashboard. I'll show you in a minute. I even am a little paranoid about my GCP project, so I like to put that in, I like to secure that as well. And this is secure. This code, this config file can be stored right alongside my code in my GitHub repo. It's completely encrypted. Out of the box, Pulumi provides a key management, an encryption key mechanism to support this. However, you can use your own key management system. So if you want to reference your own vault, your own, Amazon key management, whatever, you can leverage those instead of using the default Pulumi SaaS solution. And then we go, so if we come back here, I mentioned that I have this line here that creates my cluster. Now, the nice thing is as the engineer who wrote maybe the index file, the main file here to create my application, I don't care how this works. All I know is I'm going to give it a name for the cluster just so I have some uniqueness or, some way of identifying it. But I don't care about the details. This is where the idea of being able to create reusable modules that capture your best practices is a key part of the Pulumi use case. So here I have my K8s cluster TS module, which is essentially defining a class. And this class defines how I like to create my Kubernetes cluster. In this case, I'm creating it in Google. But I could easily, again, as far as this guy is concerned, it doesn't matter, right? This could create an Amazon Kubernetes or Azure Kubernetes. It doesn't really matter. The point is I'm able to capture those requirements around how it should be provisioned, any security requirements around it. I can capture that in this, what we call a component resource or custom resource, and leverage that over multiple applications. Since this is, again, a common programming language construct, I'm able to store these modules, these shared modules, in, say, an Artifactory if I wanted to, or some sort of common location, so that people can just pull them in. They don't have to have copies in their own repo, of course. One thing here is that this class returns various properties, one of which is the kubeconfig. And here you see an example of what we call programmatically, secretifying values. So here I'm basically telling Pulumi, treat this as a secret. And both back here, this secret, what that really means is it will not show up in any output, will not show up in logs, will not even show up in the console. The SaaS won't even know what the value is. It just it knows it's secret and leaves it at that. And then the third thing I want to show you is another way I'm able to extend Pulumi is by creating my own provider. So in this case, like I said, I wanted to have that dashboard managed right alongside my resources because it maps, directly to the cluster. So I essentially was able to create, it's very straightforward. I'm able to create what we call a dynamic provider that essentially all I have to do is define the CRUD operations. So in this case, I define, create, which is an API call to Codefresh, and that's why that you notice that API key in my config that I'm able to pass along, and then delete, for when so that Pulumi knows when I do an update and create, it knows how to create, and when I do the destroy, Pulumi knows to call the delete operation to delete the dashboard. And what's kind of neat here again is the fact that since I'm using a straightforward programming language, I'm able to leverage other packages like Axios to do the API call. So I don't have to root around in the gory details of how to do an API call. I can leverage Axios and make my life easier. So that's the code. If we come back, we'll see, oh yeah, look at that. So so if we go, you can see the two new environments showed up for my staging environment, but let's go back to let's kind of start at the build here and go through. Go through and look. So here I'm seeing, this is completed, right? The pipeline completed. And if I click on any of these steps, I can see the logs from those pipelines. So for example, I can even come up here and see all the output from Pulumi. So this is basically when you do a Pulumi up, it shows you all the stuff that's being created. And there are the outputs. And here, there's that kube config. It's a secret, so it doesn't show up out here. I'll show you in the console as well. And it created the second dashboard for the Kubernetes cluster for my staging. So this is the prod one down here. Here's the staging one. And we already saw that it created the environments. And over in Pulumi, I'll see now that I have my staging environment is deployed alongside my prod. And if I click into my staging environment, I can start to see some of those team aspects that come along, the enterprise level features, if you will, the collaboration, et cetera, that comes along with the SaaS. So here I'm able to see this update. I'm actually able to see all the changes that were made to this stack over time. It's basically been me and Codefresh, right? Me doing testing, Codefresh doing testing. I'm able to see the outputs, and again, secrets. My configuration that was used for this stack, secrets. And the resources, right? I'm able to see all the resources that were created, including my little dashboard, my little custom resource dashboard. We provide links to the actual cloud UI, in this case, Google. Now, what maybe you didn't notice it, but the fact of the matter is, I don't even care about the Google dashboard, to be honest. I have not used it. I don't need to look at it. Everything is captured, whether it's in my Codefresh views or my Pulumi views. The only time I would go over there is, maybe if there was some error that was occurring, I might then pop over there to start digging into some additional details. But the fact of the matter is, you don't even have to really hand out credentials for the cloud providers. And up here, just to kind of point out some of the other, enterprise level features out of Pulumi. Like I said, you can manage membership. You can create teams which have different permissions. So for example, our staging pipeline can write to the staging stack, but can't write to the prod stack. It can only read it in the sense, and that's used for like doing a preview to check, will the code that was just tested in staging, will it work against prod? I mentioned policies, so we have this ability to establish policies across the organization that get applied for every deployment, and then a very audit logs that show every action, whether it's stack changes or users logging in, like Paul here logged in, etc. And that's pretty much it. So I will. We can open up to questions. I think there's been some that have been. Actually, let me mention, let's do questions, and then we'll talk about some of the upcoming stuff that's going on. So I'm going to perhaps defer to some of my colleagues here because they've probably been watching the questions a bit more than I have.
Hey, Mitch, this is Praneet. So I do have one question that I think would be perfect for you to answer, which is from Andreas. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. The question is regarding the 2-stack project you worked on. Where would you put the public IPs you need for your ingress controller if you don't want to have it created implicitly?
Yeah.
Same.
I'm sorry.
Same for some firewall permissions to example managed databases and app deployment uses.
Yeah. So if I understand the question correctly, it's really about saying, if I go back to my my code, right? The idea is there are certain common resources that maybe I'm not going to deploy through Pulumi, that they're sort of preset, like an Elastic IP or something like that. So you have a couple choices, right? One is I can manage that as config, because again, stack A, my staging stack is going to use different values perhaps in my production stack. So I can manage them in there. And again, with the ability to secretify things, I can even store those as secrets in my config if I don't even want those IPs to be visible anywhere. There's also various get functions available in the Pulumi SDKs. So if you want something a bit more algorithmic, where you have this entity is always called goo, and you don't necessarily want to store the IP or whatever, or the specific information for goo, you can use a get function to get that information based on the name, let's say.
And to add to that, I will also say that for less frequently changing resources, you could also still create them through Pulumi, but have them in a separate stack, and then have a reference to that stack if you would like, in order to use that resource. And that way, you're not running any updates on those less frequently changing resources unnecessarily. But yeah, you should also check out stack references as a way to split out stacks and manage dependencies.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see, other questions.
So I can answer some things about Codefresh. First of all, there are many people asking about GitOps and Codefresh and Pulumi. We are very happy to see questions about GitOps, but for this webinar, we wanted to show the simple integration between the two tools. We have some plans for another webinar. We will see also a GitOps story on how you use GitOps plus Pulumi plus Codefresh, but not in this one. Then there are other questions asking how Codefresh compares to another CI/CD provider. And even though we can get into details like this, just in the interest of time, I simply want to reiterate the first advantage that Codefresh gives you graphical dashboards for everything. So there is a question how Codefresh compares to GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions is a great tool, but it has only the basic functionality of pipelines. You have a Git commit and then something is done with GitHub Actions. If, let's say, you perform a Kubernetes deployment, you don't have a way to see with GitHub Actions what your cluster is doing. You need to go to another dashboard and have another solution in place to see what is happening with your cluster. With Codefresh, as you saw, there is a specific dashboard that shows you what happened with your cluster after the deployment, and this can also work backwards. You can first go to the cluster dashboard and see, let's say, that version 2.5 is deployed, you click on it, and then it shows you which build created this version. If you have multiple products for looking at the cluster and creating pipelines, it's up to you to correlate the information between them, and doing correlation between builds and environments at 3 o'clock in the morning when production is down and you're on call is not a happy experience.
Very good, very good. Let's see, I'm looking to see other questions here. We have a couple minutes yet. So there was a question around scanning an existing set of resources and translating it to Pulumi. Yes, actually, there's a couple options here. The sort of more popular one is to leverage the import command, and quite honestly, I'll just pop over to an example real quick. So if I just try, where's EC2 will be a good one. All right, so I can basically, I'll use instance, something that everyone's sort of familiar with. So essentially with each of our bits of documentation for the different resources that define how to use a given resource type, there is an import example. So I'm able to use Pulumi import. It gives me the specific, parameters here. There's a command line, and what this will do, obviously, I would reference a different instance ID or whatever, but I can also store a whole set of resources, if you will, in a JSON format, and then apply that and then run Pulumi import against that. And what that'll do is it'll do two things. It'll bring those resources under Pulumi management, so the state will become part of Pulumi's knowledge, if you will, and it'll also create scaffolding code that you can then use, basically put into your Pulumi program to then manage it going forward. So it's a very powerful way to import those resources. Another use case that isn't quite an import, but sometimes you want to say, okay, I have stuff, Azure is a good example, right? If I have stuff I've been deploying in Azure, now I want to start, recreating it from Pulumi, I can leverage Pulumi's ARM to Pulumi tool to take an ARM template and convert it to Pulumi code. But I think Mitch, the question that was shown is really more about the import. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I thought you were done. But Also, I think that it would be good to answer this question about, can you have arbitrary code execute in Pulumi definition files? How does that code affect the order of resource instantiation? Since you already showed the dynamic provider, I thought that it would be great for you to kind of walk through that a little bit again and answer that question.
Yeah, and there's maybe even two parts to that question, right? In my main program, I have all these. I'm declaring various things, but there's nothing stopping me, from writing other code, right? I could do a for equals 0, whatever. I can do a for loop and have that for loop maybe spin up, if I was doing like instances or something, I could just as easily have a for loop in here that then is spinning up those instances, or calculating something and then using that later in the code. That's kind of the beauty here, right? I'm able to leverage programming languages as I need to. But then, yeah, as far as extending in general, the overall options you have, options around like the dynamic provider and being able to use, essentially this Axios is arbitrary code in a way, right? This is not a resource. I'm leveraging this API package to interact with in this case Codefresh, to create my dynamic provider. Hopefully that answers the question. Oh, I should mention, part of that question might be around, how it affects the flow. So Pulumi does understand dependencies. In fact, if I come in here real quick, I kind of showed this view of the resources. This view also shows dependencies in the sense of how they're related in terms of Pulumi. So Pulumi understands ordering, right? Pulumi understands that, especially in this case where I have, might be a good example where I'm referencing something from my Kubernetes, that K8s cluster. It knows that it needs to complete this before I can move on to this, right? It's just a natural dependency because of references. And I can even create my own sort of explicit dependencies if I want. So that the order of deployment, but at the same time, Pulumi will run as efficiently as possible and run as much in parallel as it can. And so again, the ordering and the knowledge and understanding how to deploy this is all part of what Pulumi brings along with it. Maybe one more question if...
Maybe we can answer this question about, do the devs at Pulumi or Codefresh use chat ops? Can you share some use cases? Kostis or Anais, do you want to answer for Codefresh side of things, and maybe I can then answer something from Pulumi?
Yes, we personally don't use chat ops, but we have customers that use chat ops, and almost always it's with Slack. Because people not only love, the Slack interconnection, but also they love the history of everything, where they can go back in the Slack channel and see what happened. There is a plugin that we have. I need to check if it's open source or not, but yes, you can do it with Codefresh.
Great. And for us at Pulumi, similar to what Kostis said, we do use Slack for some integration for Pulumi. Internally, we do have some Slack bots that help us improve our dev workflow. And of course, Pulumi itself supports webhooks, if you have not checked that out. So you can create any kind of Slack bot that integrates with your Pulumi stack, and you can have your infra team kind of keep tabs on what's going on. Yeah, I hope that that answers your question.
Very good. And I do maybe this one last question around how and where Pulumi stores infrastructure state. So essentially, out of the box, it's managed by the SaaS part of the solution. So state is maintained, and also as part of that provides conflict management. So you're not locking, if you will. And so yes, if I have my Kubernetes cluster, and right now I think I just deploy one node. If I went in there and changed the code or passed in a parameter to add a second node, and then I did a Pulumi up, it would know just to add the node, right? Because it already understands that we already have this infrastructure deployed. We don't need to, create a new one. So hopefully that answers that question. So, whoops, wrong way. So why don't we sort of finish up here, I think. Questions. So just, I think Kostis mentioned this as well. We have an upcoming session where we'll kind of dig more into the bigger GitOps picture. Again, the goal today was to sort of show, the basics around what Codefresh is able to do, what Pulumi is able to do, and how the two can interact. And then we'll have like I said, a larger scale GitOps presentation, if you will. And we're going to do another poll just to kind of get some feedback. And so let me throw this out here. So if you could reply and provide some feedback around these two questions, that'd be great.
And I also do want to mention there are a few questions that we weren't able to get to. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but worry not. Do join our Slack community at pulumi.slack.com and sorry, slack.pulumi.com, I think. Yeah. And you should be able to ask any questions over there. We have a very large community, and we have a lot of folks from Pulumi also hanging out in the community Slack answering questions. Same with Codefresh also, as you can see there, community.codefresh.io. So definitely sign up and ask us questions there as well.
All right, let's see, just looking at some of the responses. Excellent. Yeah, and if you go to either site, you can sign up for a free account. In the case of Pulumi, we have what we call our community account, which is essentially, I've been demoing this in an organization, but every person that sort of signs up gets this free personal space where you can deploy against, and you get the state management. You just don't have all the features around like a team use case. And then with Codefresh, you can sign up for the free account to try out the capabilities. All right. Well, I think that's it. Hopefully this was useful. Hopefully it answered a number of your questions. Maybe even, hopefully, I would say it created some more questions and allow you to explore the options here. And we look forward to speaking to you, or to the next webinar, if you will.
Sorry, one last thing. There are quite a few folks asking about the t-shirt. We have not forgotten about that, but I was hoping either Taryn or Isaac, if you're able to share some information on that.
I can address that. Yeah, we will send out a link via email to folks that attended the session and stay to the end, and we'll provide a link that gives you a free t-shirt delivered to your house.
Right on.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone. Appreciate your time, and look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.
See y'all.